Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Atlanta History Center's virtual author talk featuring Stacey Abrams tonight. I'm Dennis O'Hare, your host for this evening's program. I'm a political contributor at 90.1 WABE, where I host the Political Breakfast podcast with Democratic strategist Theron Johnson and Republican strategist Brian Robinson. Tonight, though, I will be talking with Stacey Abrams about her new book, Our Time Is Now, and you can purchase additional signed copies of the book directly from the official bookseller, Acapella Books. And you can do that at the link in the chat to the right of your screen, and also at the link provided on the History Center's website. And you can ask questions. You can start doing that now. We'll get to them later in the conversation. So as we're talking, please submit your questions via the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, and I'll try to get to as many of them as I'm sure we'll have a lot, probably more questions than we have time. So apologies in advance to anyone whose question isn't addressed. Stacey Abrams really doesn't need much of an introduction to audiences here in Atlanta. She is the best-selling author of Lead from the Outside. She's a graduate of Spelman College right here in Atlanta and has graduate degrees from the University of Texas at Austin and Yale University Law. She's been a tax attorney, an assistant Atlanta city attorney, a Georgia state representative, state house minority leader, and Democratic nominee for governor in 2018. She's also the founder of Fair Fight and other organizations to promote voting rights and fair elections, and also training and hiring young people of color. She joins us from her home here in Atlanta. Stacey Abrams, it's a pleasure.
Thank you, Dennis. Thanks. I also want to say thank you to the Atlanta History Center and Acapella Books, but particularly to you for doing this with me.
My pleasure. Before we even get to the book, because things just keep happening, much as we try to slow them down, the Supreme Court, in a 6-3 decision, just ruled that the ban against job discrimination, which was written into the 1964 Civil Rights Act, protects lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender Americans as well. Now, the act bans discrimination on the basis, and this is in the words of the act, is the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. And the majority opinion, which was written by Justice Neil Gorsuch, found that LGBTQ plus people fall under the ban against discrimination based on sex. So there's the groundwork here. And I know you love a good legal argument. So before we get into the book, let me just ask you about a point raised by the dissenting justices in the case. Justice Brett Kavanaugh argued that the majority, in protecting LGBTQ people under the protections based on sex, went beyond the law as it was written, since in 1964, nobody in Congress at the time was thinking about protecting gay and lesbian rights, and transgender was something not even on anybody's radar at the time. The dissenting justices argued that Congress has had chances since to add sexual orientation to the Civil Rights Act, and it hasn't done it. So that's a sign of congressional intent in their view, and the majority is actually writing law for Congress in this decision, which is something it shouldn't do. So this is a meaty legal argument, and you love those, so I wanted to get your thoughts on that particular point.
Well, I would actually say this does tie into Our Time Is Now, because I spend some time talking about identity and movements. And although it's been hidden a bit in our narrative, the conversation about the LGBTQ community started long before the Stonewall Riot.
Yeah.
It started, in fact, there was a large conversation that was burgeoning during World War II. And so I would argue that Justice Kavanaugh does not know what was on the minds of every person who participated in that conversation, often because those conversations were subverted by the social mores of to use the language basis of sex. In this day and age, we understand that sex involves not only gender, but gender identity and sexual orientation. And I think it is a natural penumbra under which to include these communities, because the sex that they claim, the sex that they hold, the sex they identify with, their choice of partners are all implicated by the discrimination. And so I completely side with the majority. And I think that it's a bit of a facile argument that is made by the minority, in part because their goal is to restrain access. And as long as our access to justice is only based on what was in the original framing of any document, then those who need support the most will always be shoved out of access and out of reach.
You don't think that there's any merit to Justice Kavanaugh's argument that that's Congress's job, not the courts?
It's the court's job to understand the scope of what Congress intends. But what I'm arguing is that knowing what Congress intended, if they said on the basis of sex, they didn't explicitly restrict sex to only mean the gender you were assigned at birth. Therefore, I would argue in the affirmative that on the basis of sex includes all those things that now are included in the notions of sex and sexual identity in America.
Real quickly, did it surprise you that it was Justice Gorsuch who wrote the opinion for the majority?
I will say that I was pleasantly surprised.
No more than that. He is a Trump appointee.
Neil Gorsuch and Brett Kavanaugh come to the court, I think, with challenges embedded in how they arrived. But I would hold to this. We've seen justices appointed who have gone beyond the restrictions that and the prejudices that informed their appointment. And so if Neil Gorsuch in this moment wants to be on the side of right, I welcome him and hope he stays.
Let's pick up on some of the other themes in your book here. And obviously, it seems an amazing moment that Georgia's primary election came about and had the problems it did just as your book came out. And there's no question that the primary election was a mess, to put it politely, and that the problems for voters disproportionately affected poor communities and communities of color. But in your book, you're arguing that these kinds of things aren't just inexperience with new machines or lack of funding or incompetence or negligence, that this is by design, that it's intentional. And yet, when you look at the turnout for this past primary election, Democratic turnout for that one primary soared past the 1 million mark. That is a record. So you would think that if Republican leaders intentionally tried to suppress turnout, they'd certainly do a better job than that.
Well, I want to begin with an analysis I do in the book, which is that there's this false connection being drawn between voter suppression and voter participation. Suppression is the attempt to block access, and it works. But participation often inversely increases when suppression increases, in part because people are angered by it to keep them out of participation. And the reality is voter suppression doesn't mean no one votes. It means eligible voters are denied the opportunity to do so. And what we saw in Georgia was a combination of incompetence and malfeasance. The incompetence goes to the machines that were chosen, how they were administered, how support was given across the state. But the malfeasance speaks to the broader set of structures, not only in Georgia, but across the country. And as I talk about in the book, there are 3 general buckets of voter suppression. Can you register and stay on the rolls? Can you get access to a ballot? And does that ballot get counted? And the reality is, until we fix all 3 sets of challenges, as long as a single eligible voter is denied the right to vote, not through their own choice, but through the act of an administrator or the act of law, that is problematic, and that is what we have to push back on.
Well, let me talk about acts of administrators on this. And one of the reasons for the high participation in the Democratic primary particularly was that a lot of people got absentee ballots. The applications for those ballots were mailed to every voter in the state by the new Republican Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger. And he did this at a time when the leader of his own party, President Trump, was trashing absentee voting as a reason for fraud. So do Secretary Raffensperger's actions here at least mitigate somewhat against the argument of intentionality? Incompetence and negligence may be pretty obvious, but what about intentionality here?
So the Democratic Party worked with the Secretary of State to decide to send out those applications, but I do want to correct this. They did not go to every voter. They went to only active voters, which means new voters who had just registered or anyone who'd been pushed on the inactive list but had not been purged from the list did not receive those applications. And so that's an important caveat. The second thing is that, yes, he indeed did the right thing, and we celebrated and publicly celebrated what he did, but he immediately followed up by giving into the narrative being pushed by Donald Trump. And he created this AirSats voter fraud task force that is laden with law enforcement officials in order to scare people. Basically, the rule was, if you make a mistake, we're going to come after you, which intended to have a chilling effect. So yes, while I'll give him credit for doing the right thing, the subsequent decisions, the voter fraud task force, vending it out to a third party was unable to meet their obligation, the failure to get those ballots to all of the people who requested them, my inability as well as thousands of others to use the ballots they received, those are all parts of the challenge. And you don't get credit for a good idea if you're unable to fully execute. And so while I will give him props for the moment, the overarching administration of our elections was not worthy of the state of Georgia.
Real quickly, just on that voter fraud commission for a moment, is it a viable political theory that he did that perhaps, and I have no way of knowing this, but just a thought that he needed to do that to give himself political, I don't know if cover's the right word, but some sort of cred with Republicans that he was still going after the voter fraud that they say exists, while he was also trying to get ballots to everybody.
Georgia is a state that is very narrowly divided in its politics. And so and we do not register by party. The Secretary of State, in order to serve even those who support him, if he wanted to send it to anyone, he was going to have to send it to everyone if they were going to go beyond the 65 and older who can automatically request absentee ballots each year. So part of the decision-making, I think, was that he was going to do it and needed to do it because there were elections and primaries happening on both sides of the aisle. But I absolutely agree that the reason for the task force was to cater to the Republican notion that the rarity of voter fraud was somehow going to need to be validated. But we've seen that not only with Brad Raffensperger, but if you look at the Secretary of State, Michael Adams in Kentucky, who also was chastised for sending out absentee ballots, what happened in Iowa, where the state legislature is trying to pull back from one of the most successful elections they've had because the Republican Secretary of State sent out those absentee ballots. It's part of an intentional voter intimidation process that we're seeing crop up across the country, led by Republicans, because this is the first year since 1981 that the RNC can actually actively participate financially in voter intimidation and voter suppression activities. And so this is part of a larger pattern. That larger pattern does not exempt anyone, even if they do one good thing. If they participate in the rest, it undercuts the legitimacy of their intent.
Two quick thoughts on that. If they were going to target communities of color and poor people as specifically as that, would they have then had the numbers of problems they did in lots of other counties? I mean, while the Secretary of State was saying, oh, it's just Fulton County, Speaker Ralston, whom you know well, said, we had problems all over the state. And it wasn't just in those counties that Secretary Raffensperger was talking about.
Which is why I've always alleged and always stated very publicly that the problem with voter suppression is that your target may be one community, but when you break the machinery of democracy, you break it for everyone. In 2018, it hit me, it hit Democrats who were running for office, but it also captured Dan Gassaway, who had to have 3 elections in Habersham County, which is no area where Democrats have a shot of winning anything.
And Dan Gassaway is a Republican.
Is a Republican. He was a Republican who had to have a Republican primary run 3 times. The challenge is that incompetence and malfeasance often sit side by side. And what's the most offensive about what happened here in Georgia is the Secretary of State's deliberate indifference to the needs of voters. It's why you heard Republican Mike Boyce, the chairman of Cobb County, demand his resignation or his accountability. It's why the Secretary of the Speaker of the House has called him to task. I don't suggest that incompetence isn't part of this, which is what we saw happen across the state. But we cannot use the incompetence to mask the malfeasance that continues to harm communities of color who attempt to vote in the state of Georgia.
Speaking of the speaker, he has asked the House Governmental Affairs Committee to look into all of this. Confidence that the speaker will make sure it's a thorough investigation that might even consider allegations of intent as well as incompetence.
I would be hopeful, having worked with the speaker, although I will point out that he signed on to an amicus brief. Actually, I don't think it's an amicus brief, but he signed on to a challenge to Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which would further erode protections for communities of color against intentional rules that block and prohibit their ability to participate in the right to vote. Having already seen Section 5 eviscerated by the Voting Rights Act, going after Section 2 has long been an intention of the conservatives. And so while I have the deepest respect for the Speaker of the House writ large, I'm deeply concerned about his attention and his intention to undermine one of the remaining pillars of the Voting Rights Act, and that is to go after Section 2. But until proven otherwise, I'm pleased that he is at least looking into the administration of elections so that in November, every Georgian has the right to vote.
So I guess it comes down to this on the idea that it was intentional. In our conversation here and in your book, you lay out a pretty good circumstantial case for intent in addition to incompetence. In other words, okay, if this is true and this is true and this is true and this is true, it probably wasn't by accident. But do you have a smoking gun that says, yeah, they really did mean to do it and they say so?
Well, we've had Republican leaders who have, in fact, I'm trying to remember whether it was Pennsylvania or North Carolina, where the legislator who helped push one of the voter ID laws said, this will help us win the elections because they're not going to be able to meet the challenge.
Yeah, but that was, I'm talking about here in Georgia.
Well, in Georgia, I would point to the number of lawsuits that multiple organizations have had to file against the Secretary of State, both the current Secretary of State and his predecessor. Yes, I believe there is intention. Yes, I believe that we have shown that intention. And I think the experience that people saw play out across the state of Georgia, but very, very strategically and very unfortunately voluminously in the metro Atlantic communities, where it wasn't simply the inoperability of the machines. It was long lines because of under-resourcing. It's the combination of effects. And that's one of the reasons our time is now focuses for the first half of the book on understanding what suppression looks like, because the challenge of suppression is it doesn't have the smoking gun of Bull Connor. It doesn't have the smoking gun of, Lester, while it's driven in
Lester
by
Maddox.
Lester Maddox. I was doing George Wallace and Lester Maddox in the same moment. It doesn't have that smoking gun moment. Instead, it looks like administrative rules. It looks like the labyrinthine desert that folks are forced into as they try desperately to get to a vote, starving along the way, thinking that it's their fault that they didn't understand. And that's one of the reasons it's so insidious and so effective. Voter suppression no longer has the racially motivated language that we were used to pre-Voting Rights Act. Now it's facially neutral rules that have a very complete and targeted effect on communities that are the least likely to be able to fight back. And until we divorce the conversation of intent and effect from investigating what's in the heart, but looking at what happens in the lines, what happens in the receipt of absentee ballots, the fact that African American and Latino voters are 2 times as likely to have those ballots rejected, that young people are 5 times more likely. Until we stop looking for the smoking gun and look at the littered corpses of voting rights, then we're not going to see change.
Let me quickly come back for one more point on Secretary Raffensperger for a moment. I mean, you mentioned voter roll purges as a tool of suppression. You also say, of course, we have to maintain the voter rolls, make changes when people die or they move away, for instance. Now, Secretary Raffensperger has announced plans to purge more names, some 300,000 plus of them. But he also said he will publish the names and contact information so people can check to see if they're on the list they shouldn't be, and they can stop being purged. That's the kind of transparency we have not had before in purges here in Georgia. Does that again say, hey, we're not intending to purge names that shouldn't be?
If the Secretary of State didn't intend to purge people who shouldn't have been purged, then he would have complied with the law passed in 2019 that kept more than 100,000 people on the rolls, or should have kept them on the rolls, when he did his purge in December. It took our lawsuit to force him to put 22,000 people back on the rolls that he had mistakenly purged. And unfortunately, his refusal to comply with the law in December meant that 107,000 people who, under a piece of legislation passed by Republicans, signed by a Republican governor, that protected them from being purged, were still taken off the rolls because no one would enforce that responsibility. I do not trust the Secretary of State. I do not trust his intention, because he has demonstrated by word and deed his willingness to strip people of their right to vote. And the second piece is the notification. Yes, you can notify, but if these were people who were normally aware of what was happening, the question is, are you notifying them by putting something in the Fulton County Legal Journal? Are you putting it, or is it front page in the AJC? How are you reaching people? The communities that are most likely to be purged are the least likely to be participatory in those practices. And so the better answer is only remove people because they are dead, because they have moved. Don't remove people because it's just easier than doing the hard work. There are only 9 states in the country that have purge rules on their books. That does not have to be the way we clean our rolls. And because Georgia has made so many mistakes, it is incumbent upon the state to err on the side of caution and err on the side of trusting voters. We do not have an overvoting problem in Georgia. What we do have is a purge problem, and that should stop.
You mentioned, or you alluded to just now, the fact that different states have different rules. It's a total hodgepodge. And one of the things you argue for in the book is federal laws requiring things like automatic registration and same-day registration. But since the details of voting rules, in other words, there's federal law that says you can't discriminate against people, but the details are delegated to the state. So if you start getting that specific about automatic registration, same-day registration at the federal level, you run into a constitutional problem here.
Well, what I would argue for is that for federal elections, which the federal government is allowed to set universal rules for, that automatic registration and same-day registration is permissible. Because we live in a country that's one of the few democratized, industrialized nations that requires state-by-state registration. In most nations, it is an automatic process that is administered at the federal level, and it covers everyone. And the problem is that we have 50 different sets of administrative rules that even the most learned attorneys could not possibly recite to you. And if I leave the state of Georgia and cross the border into Alabama, my rights as a citizen disappear. If I want to vote absentee, if I want to go and vote early, that's problematic. And if I go to Oregon, I'm in a nirvana of electoral access. And so the reality is we should not live in a state or in a nation where our right to exercise our democratic purview to vote is contained and constrained by the zip code that we live in. Being able to vote in a federal election should not be constrained by the fact that you crossed a border. And so it is absolutely constitutional for there to be automatic registration and same-day registration for the purposes of federal elections. If states want to maintain a separate system so they can continue to restrict and restrain and suppress voters, that is deeply problematic, and we need to address that next. But by statute, we should absolutely address the fundamentals, which is that if you have the eligibility to vote in federal elections, it should not matter which state you live in, as long as you can get back on the rolls.
So would that be your answer then to the potential collision of constitutional provisions here, where the Equal Protection Clause says everybody ought to have the same rights and access to them, and there's the clause in the amendments that says anything that the federal government is not specifically authorized to do goes to the states?
Well, there is no collision, because this would only apply to federal elections, which settled law says the federal government has the right to do, which is what became the genesis of the Voting Rights Act of 1965.
Let's shift to something else you talk about in the book. There's been a lot of talk, of course, about your decision not to concede the 2018 election to Brian Kemp. But in your book, you also say that you decided to challenge the election because you said you feared, and these are your words, that the stories of disenfranchised voters would be overshadowed by one politician's crusade for redemption. So if that's why you decided not to challenge the election legally, wouldn't that have been a reason to concede, albeit begrudgingly, because that's exactly what your opponents are now saying you're doing with not conceding, that you're making it about one politician's crusade for redemption.
And I would say that that is the branch that they're grasping at. But if you look at the national narrative, what we have seen is that what I hoped for has actually happened. There is now a national conversation about voter suppression. There is now a national crusade to ensure that every person who is legally eligible has the right to vote. There is a statewide conversation driven in part by our litigation that has forced the state already to make changes, not sufficient to meet the standard that we should hold in the state of Georgia, but steps that we need to take. And that happened because I did two things. One, I did not challenge my election because that, as I said, would have created this would have become just about me. But what I did say is that I challenged the system that allowed this election to occur the way it did. And by challenging the system, that is giving voice to the AME churches that joined as plaintiffs, to Ebenezer Baptist Church that joined as a plaintiff, to those who were denied the right to vote, including the 54 to 85,000 people who lived in those communities where polling places shut down, the disproportionate number of absentee and provisional ballots that were thrown out, or worse, that were never even considered. Those people and those votes and those voices are now having a moment of consideration, and there is a national conversation that did not exist. And while I don't take complete credit for it, I do believe I was instrumental in lifting this issue up, and that's why it's so important to me that I didn't fight to make myself governor. I fought to make sure that voting rights and voting access are real in America.
But given that, why even give your opponents an avenue to say, with the refusal to concede, look, she's doing this and it's distracting from that conversation. And they could, the point is that the whole thing gets lost somehow.
I find it only distracting to those who wanted me to shut up.
Let me pick up on something else, and actually, it's part of what you talk about in the book, the argument that a lot of people get discouraged. And in the aftermath of the shooting of Rayshard Brooks here in Atlanta, there was one young protester, and this was one that I heard in one of the media reports that I looked at. He said, "I am tired of people telling me that the solution is to go vote." What would you say to him?
I understand. I think he's absolutely right, because usually the narrative is this terrible thing happens, this injustice occurs. If you just go vote, it'll get better. That's not true. And it's disingenuous, and it's close to being a lie, because the truth is voting doesn't make the world better by itself, but voting is an instrumental part of that success. I liken it to someone having a disease. But the nation has a disease, and those diseases can be treated, and part of the treatment is voting. But the reality is when you have a disease, every treatment you take doesn't necessarily instantaneously cure you. But not taking the medicine, not following the treatment, not getting the therapy, those will guarantee that you get worse. So sometimes voting is just about stopping bad from becoming worse. But more often when we vote and then we stay engaged in the system, things do start to get better. But the responsibility of those who are exhorting these demonstrators to just go vote is to tell the truth, that voting is not going to change everything, that there's no salvation that's coming from a single person's election or from a single moment of casting a ballot, but that the process of voting, the process of engagement, the process of accountability is how we build a new system to replace the broken system that is causing and wreaking so much havoc. And we also have to explain how the systems work, that it is insufficient to be angry at a congressional leader about the issue of citizen arrests in Georgia, because citizen arrests in Georgia are state law. So let's make sure you're voting for a state legislator who can change the law. Let's make sure you're voting for a DA who will not let the murderers of Ahmaud Arbery go free for 74 days. Let's make sure we're also thinking about qualified immunity, and we're voting for congressmen and women and for senators who will actually do the work of taking away these protections that allow, unfortunately, law enforcement officers to operate with impunity. Those are things that we have to talk about. So it's insufficient to sloganize the solutions. We've got to do the hard work of explaining it's a process that is hard and tedious and complex, but it is necessary, and that's why we have to do it.
Speaking of hard and tedious and complex, this year's legislative session has been more of that than usual because of COVID-19. They are gathering again as we speak to try to finish the session. A lot more attention because of some of the things you just mentioned on a hate crimes bill. And it passed your old chamber, the House. Speaker Ralston has asked the Senate to pass it with no amendments. It provides 12 months, up to 12 months, for a misdemeanor conviction that's tied to targeting a particular group. And for a high and aggravated misdemeanor, 6 to 12 months; for a felony, not less than 2 years. Is that adequate in your view, or should there be more in it? Or do you agree with Speaker Ralston that if we put more in there now, given how little time there is, and the Senate works on it, and it goes back to the House, that they'll run out of time to pass anything?
I think the process has to begin, and given how long it has taken for us to even get back to a moment of having a hate crimes bill, now is the time to pass something not less than what is before the legislature, but this is a good beginning. And the reality is that we can vote in November for new leadership that might and hopefully will come back and add to it. But we also have to recognize that a hate crimes bill is insufficient to solve the exposed brokenness of our system. It is also the fact that the district attorney, 2 of them, were able to pass on justice. It's the fact that those men thought that it was perfectly acceptable to hunt down this man and shoot him in the streets simply because they thought they could. Those are also challenges that cannot go unanswered, which is why we have to talk about citizens arrest laws and why we have to talk about stand your ground. And that means that we're going to have to come back again and again and again to get justice for Ahmaud Arbery.
Do you think that those that you just mentioned, citizens arrest, stand your ground, changing those, are more important, more urgent than a hate crimes bill?
No, and I think we find ourselves having these dichotomous arguments, these binary conversations.
Well, it's just because of the time that the legislature has,
Well, I think it's a couple of things. I think that we know, you and I both know, that if the state legislature had the intent, they could strip a bill and they could hijack a bill and add something on and do it if they wanted to.
They have done that.
We do not seem to have the political will in the legislature to address these issues, but hopefully we can at least get to the conversation of citizen arrest laws, which have long outlived their usefulness. Stand your ground implicates so many more things that I think it will require a longer time period. But I think we can push for a hate crimes bill that is unfettered by any of the and largely homophobic concerns that the Senate has expressed before. And at the same time, we can address the citizens arrest laws that allowed Ahmaud Arbery to be murdered in his hometown.
Real quickly, speaking of the Senate, Lieutenant Governor Duncan has said we need to strengthen the bill by putting in civil recourse, for instance, or perhaps more reporting. I think there are even some African-American lawmakers who are kind of divided on that. Some of them think, yeah, he really means what he says. We might get a stronger bill out of the Senate and still have time to pass it in the House. Others are worried that this is a poison pill to gum up the works and keep anything from passing.
11 years of experience teach me that the poison pill is the more likely issue, even if that's not what the lieutenant governor intends. You and I both know that intention sometimes falls before coercion, and it certainly falls before those who are less noble in their efforts. And so moving a bill that can meet at least a basic standard of justice is critical, knowing that there should also be a public commitment to come back and add more. But we know that COVID-19 has not disappeared from the state. We don't know how long, if the 11 days will actually be a full 11 days. And so I think immediate action, the exigency of the circumstances require that we do as much as we can. And if there is an agreed upon process, use it and let's get this done, because we've been too long waiting for it to happen.
We are going to get to as many questions as we can in just a second, but there's sort of the, I don't know if it's the elephant or the donkey in the room, because we're talking about a national Democratic campaign. You have said you are open to being selected as the vice presidential nominee of your party by Joe Biden, who has now clinched the nomination. Have you been contacted, vetted by the former vice president's team? Have they contacted you to arrange something of a screening process?
The vetting process is being operated by the Biden campaign, and I encourage anyone curious about it to reach out to their campaign.
You can't say whether you've been contacted by them?
I will say that the vetting process is being administered by the Biden campaign, and I encourage anyone who is curious to reach out to the campaign for more information.
There's a group that's very active on social media called Draft Stacey Abrams. No doubt you've heard of them. Are you coordinating with them?
Not at all.
They're, I believe, part of Move On. Is that correct? MoveOn.org.
I do not know the origin. I appreciate the intent, but the reality is Joe Biden is going to decide who his partner should be. He is the only person in this conversation who has held the job. He is the person who knows what he needs in a partner. He knows the kind of profile that he wants to create with this position, and I leave it to him to say what he's going to do. I've been not at all reticent about answering the questions for 14 months, although I'll point out that I've given the exact same answer for more than a year. Although recent answers have somehow stirred up interest, I've said the exact same thing for more than 14 months. And at this point, the decision remains with one person, and I look forward to hearing what he says. But no matter what his decision, I look forward to helping make him the next president of the United States.
At the end of your book, there's a chapter that broadens the focus from local elections, state elections, national elections, to the entire globe. And coming as it does at a time, when you said you've been open to a vice presidential nomination, is one of the reasons for that chapter, a chance to show the Biden folks, hey, I can talk foreign policy too.
I am not that prescient. I signed the contract to write this book in January of 2019. Just as I did not predict that the book would come out on the day of the Georgia primary, I did not know what would happen in terms of this election cycle. I spoke to what I know and what I've learned and what I've focused on, which is that I've long had an interest in the global positioning of the United States, but also the responsibilities we have and how we engage on an international level. In fact, my first foreign policy experience was I was a Salzburg Seminar Fellow on youth civic engagement. I went to Austria to work with international groups to talk about how we got young people to vote in the United States and around the country. So there has been a very natural through line for me when it comes to the conversation about foreign policy and foreign affairs. And for me, it was a natural chapter to include in the book.
One quick final thought, and then we'll go to questions. If you are not tapped by the vice president or former vice president to be the next vice presidential nominee, I imagine you would certainly consider another run at Governor Kemp in 2022. Is that what you would do if you are not selected by Mr. Biden?
I've long said that you need to run for the right job at the right time for the right reason. That is certainly a job I've expressed very clear interest in, and I will certainly look at it again and decide what I'm going to do in 22 if I am not serving. But the reality is my focus right now is on making sure we have a fair fight through having elections that actually allow people not only in Georgia but around the country to participate fully in the democratic process. I'm also focused on the 2020 census, which is why I dedicate a full chapter to the importance of the census, particularly for progressives. And that's why I created the organization Fair Count. And I believe in having the type of policies that make the South a leader in economic justice, which is why I created the Southern Economic Advancement Project. So regardless of what other people decide, my focus is on the work I can do now to respond to COVID, to respond to voter suppression, and to ensure that we have an accurate census that counts everyone, especially those that are the most likely to be left out.
Okay, let's get to some of the questions. This one comes from an anonymous attendee. And it goes back to what we were talking about just a few moments ago, and that is justice and law enforcement. And she says, can you elaborate on your position, or he or she says, can you elaborate on your position on defunding the police? And first, I think we should, to you, what does defunding the police mean in practical terms?
Well, as I said earlier, I think that we are finding ourselves spiraling down these rabbit holes of dichotomy that you can do one thing or the other. I will tell you where I stand. I believe that we have to reform the behavior of public safety officers and of law enforcement officers to make certain that public safety is their primary responsibility. That means looking at qualified immunity. It means making certain that we limit how someone can immunize themselves against bad actions. It is making certain that we have stronger rules about the use of deadly force. It is making certain not only that we protect people from murder by their police officers and by law enforcement, but that we also remove the degradation that so many Black people experience with encounters with law enforcement. Not everyone, but sufficient number that it is a part of our cultural experience. And that we understand that it is not, while it is directed and felt and experienced by Black men and women so frequently, it is experienced by other communities of color, and we should make certain that there is a trust relationship that is inviolate between public safety, and that means reforming their experiences and their interactions to make that so. At the exact same time, we need to have a conversation and we need to take steps to reallocate resources. Sometimes that means reducing resources. If you have a limited budget, I would absolutely support the notion that we should be investing in healthcare, in education, in community building, in banking, in the things that make communities strong enough to make crime less likely, to make poverty less likely. And that reallocation of resources, that decision to invest in the things that make us stronger, is a choice we make all the time for wealthier communities. We should do that for communities that are the least likely to be advantaged and the most likely to face the ravages of the systemic injustice and systemic inequities that we experience right now in our police system. And so I'm not going to argue the language, because I believe that we have to focus on the substance. I believe in reformation of how police officers practice, and I believe in a transformation of how we invest and what we invest in.
Heather Russell has an election question. She says, I'm thinking of volunteering to be a poll worker in November. In addition to the regular training, how should I prepare? And I imagine she means herself personally, for special problems we have been seeing in our recent elections. What particular actions can poll workers take on election day to help ensure fair voting? And I'm sure there are rules beyond which they can't go either.
Well, I would encourage you to go to fairfightaction.com or just fairfight.com. That's one of the pieces we work on, making sure that people know what the rights are, what citizens should expect, what eligible voters are entitled to. And so by starting there, we are a nonpartisan organization, Fair Fight Action, and the work we do is to help make certain that every voter is protected, and we'd be happy to help you. So fairfightaction.com or .org, you'll find us and we'll be happy to help.
The answer may be the same to this one. This is Elizabeth Muller, who says, do you have any advice for a registered Georgia voter whose absentee ballot submitted in an official ballot drop box remains listed as not received on the My Georgia Voter website? I've already reached out to elected official and the Secretary of State's office, and have not received a follow-up. I'm assuming it might be the same answer.
Well, I would, yes, please. But actually, if you will email story@fairfightaction.com, we would love to get your story. We would love to be able to help you at least find out what's happened. And we also have a voter protection hotline whose number escapes me. I think it's 888-730-5816. But if you go to our website, you'll learn more about what you can do, and we would be happy to help you track down what's happened to your ballot and get you connected with those who can help.
This one is something that, well, let me pick up this one. This is from Chris Hooker, who says, what are some things that the Biden campaign can be doing better or should be doing right now to help disenfranchised people vote?
We've actually been in a lot of conversations with the Biden campaign, and it has been very fruitful. They understand the work we're doing, not only here in Georgia, but around the country. and they understand the importance of investing in voter protection. The best way to ensure that people are not disenfranchised is to ensure that the rules are applied equally and that they are not rules that explicitly or implicitly harm a certain community. For example, we know that in Wisconsin, among other states, to use an absentee ballot, you have to have a signature from a witness. If you are quarantining in place and you do not have a significant other, getting someone to sign your absentee ballot in October may be impossible. There are 4 states, I believe, or 10 states that require either signature from witness or a notary. I dare anyone who lives in a rural community to be able to identify a notary right now, and even folks in urban communities knowing where to go and knowing that they're going to be in their office to notarize your ballot is almost an impossibility. And so one thing that the Biden campaign is helping us understand and expand on is that the work that Fair Fight 2020 started was designed for this moment, to use the primaries as a testing ground, to understand exactly what was happening in 2020 in elections, to recommend changes, to build up an army of volunteers who understand how to protect the right to vote, and then to turn it over to the Biden campaign so that they can work in concert with Fair Fight and with the DNC to make certain that every vote counts and every voter matters.
Sarah asks, it can feel discouraging as a woman to constantly come up against glass ceilings at work and in the community. What advice do you have on staying resilient in making change?
One is that we have to, it sounds hokey, but being true to yourself is actually a critical thing. Authenticity matters. And part of being authentic is owning your capacity for success. We're often told to edit our desires to mold what we want to the shape of what preceded us or what people can take, what they expect. I don't believe in that. I believe that our responsibility is to determine our mission and do our best to get there with respect and intentionality and integrity. I believe that too often we are taught, particularly as women and people of color, that basically that humility and self-effacement are the same things. Self-effacement says, I can't do it, I didn't do it, I was just part of it. Humility says, yes, I did it, but I'm not the only one who can. I believe in practicing humility. I believe in saying, yes, I did this, but that is not to say that others couldn't. But I will never practice self-effacement where I deny my capacity, because the reality is when you are self-effacing as a woman or a person of color, people believe you. When you say, I didn't do it, I can't do it, that wasn't me, they're going to believe you. And the next time someone who looks like you, the next time someone who shares your, whatever the challenges that you have, whatever issues you may face, the next time they see someone with your profile, they're going to impute to that person what you've said about your incapacity. And so I believe always in humility, knowing I'm not the only one, but I'm never going to deny that I'm good at what I can do.
Denise Rayner says, how does one go about changing the Board of Elections? It seems, she says, the Fulton County Board should acknowledge their incompetence and resign. Boards of elections are interesting things because they oversee the elections, but they don't get into the nitty-gritty of running it. You have an elections director who answers to the board.
So actually, Carolyn Hughley, who served as the whip during my 7 years as Democratic leader, and she served as whip before I was there.
Yeah, she's from Columbus.
Columbus, Georgia.
Yep.
She actually tried to convene, I think it was last year, a study committee to look at exactly that issue. Because the problem is there is no uniformity to the structuring and the seating of members of boards of elections. Some counties do it one way, other counties do it another way. And part of the problem is the lack of uniformity. And that lack of uniformity means that your access to a well-administered election can vary based on where you live. But let's be clear, while Fulton County does have some culpability, the larger responsibility rests on the uniformity that the state of Georgia has impugned and put in the responsible hands, or should be the responsible hands, of the Secretary of State. We have an election superintendent for that reason, because we should not have 159 different sets of rules for how our elections happen. Democracy shouldn't change when you cross state lines, and it also shouldn't change when you cross county lines. And so while the finger pointing is directed by the Secretary of State at the counties, particularly Fulton County. We have to hold the Secretary of State accountable for investment, for training, and for his overarching responsibility to ensure that we have elections, including if he sees problems, making sure he works with that county to improve their situation, not blame them after things have fallen apart when he I won't say misappropriated, but when he used $400,000 to do self-congratulatory commercials that could have paid for 1,600 poll workers in Georgia on Tuesday. 1,600 poll workers making $20 an hour could have made a world of difference in our elections, but he did not do his job, and he should not be let off the hook for it.
Just as a quick follow-up to that, on the Political Breakfast podcast, Theron Johnson was saying that one of the things that he expects to come out of these hearings that the speaker has convened is that there wasn't a whole lot of communication either way between the counties and the Secretary of State's office. If a county is running into a problem, though, isn't it up to them to contact the Secretary of State? And I'm talking about not just on election day, but even before.
And I would argue that the world knew that there were challenges facing Fulton County, that there was communication. I wasn't in the midst of it, but if you read a newspaper, if you listened to a story.
Yeah, I'm not just talking about Fulton specifically.
But, and my point is, if you go all the way back to the decision to purchase $107 million worth of new machines, when you had both Fair Fight, a fairly progressive, nonpartisan organization, and Freedom Works, a fairly conservative organization run by Charles Koch, when we both raised concerns about those machines and their deployment, when a federal judge warned the Secretary of State about how he was going to do this effectively, every one of those warning signs put the responsibility on the Secretary of State to take affirmative action to get this done right. And he had a model to follow, because Kathy Cox in 2002 had the same obligation. And yet she managed to communicate very effectively with every county to provide them with the resources, the training, and with the emergency help they needed. The Secretary of State failed in his duties. And ultimately, the buck stops with the person who has the constitutional responsibility for our elections. And we can certainly ask for more and should demand more from our counties, but ultimately the responsibility is on the Secretary of State, particularly when he alone has the capacity and has the authority to determine the machines used and the management of our elections. And let's be clear, he used that authority when Athens-Clarke County decided they wanted to go with paper ballots. So if he believes that he can tell them what to do, he needs to do that everywhere, and he needs to be held accountable for doing his job.
A lot of questions I want to follow up on with that, but I want to get to a couple more here. Rich Eldridge says, as a young person, you raised your voice as a Vox ATL contributor. What advice do you have for today's young people, especially teens of color, who want to affect change? And all of a sudden, he's talking to you not as a young person, apparently.
No, I believe crossing 46 and the necessity of reading glasses kind of negates that. But I can remember that far back. Vox was an extraordinary opportunity for me because it validated both the rage that I was feeling in the wake of the Rodney King protest, in the wake of watching communities crumble under poverty, but it also gave me a space to explore my thinking and to organize my thoughts. And that's why when I've watched the demonstrations and protests, there are two decisions I made. One is I'm not going to castigate people for how they protest. And I know that has been a fairly embittered conversation, but I know what it feels like to be that anguished and to have that kind of rage and concern about whether anyone thinks that you matter. And so I support the protesters, but I also have not joined in those protests directly, in part because and I understand the good intentions of those who do, but for my purposes, I want to make sure there's always space for younger voices to be heard, and they are often drowned out by the presence of those who can attract more attention. And so I've tried to work behind the scenes on bail, making sure those who get arrested get the support they need, trying to make sure that there's organizing support, doing what I can to help, but never overshadowing their voices. And for everyone who has a young person in their life who wants to be heard, encourage them to speak, and not just through writing, but to show up at the city council meetings. even if they're going to be on the phone, they're making budget decisions. Call, ask your questions, show up at the Capitol, wherever you can be present, because we're setting the course of your future. And your voice matters because you're going to inherit whatever decisions we make.
Got just a couple of minutes left here. By the way, I'm a few years more past 46 and here are mine. So
there you go.
Got the readers here too. I do want to pick up on something because you mentioned protests at the Capitol. And right now at the Capitol, there's debate about the future of one of the most prominent features right outside the Capitol, which is the statue of General Gordon on his horse and other Confederate monuments and memorials. And in the book, you talk about being up in Dalton and being asked by somebody, and this is during your 2018 campaign, what about Confederate monuments and memorials, and particularly Stone Mountain with the carvings of Jefferson and Lee and Lee and Jefferson Davis and Stonewall Jackson. And you said, if I recall correctly, at the time, that wasn't at the top of your list of things to do. You understood the question, but that wasn't what you were focused on. Given what's happened recently, is that still the case?
So what I said to that woman, what I've said over and over again since 2017 when I first answered this question, I believe that these are monuments to domestic terrorists. I believe that they belong in museums where they can be contextualized, but they should not be in places of honor, particularly places of honor that are supported by my tax dollars and by the tax dollars of those who are descendants of those they sought to terrorize, and some people who still live through that terror. And so I do not support the public honorifics given to Confederate generals or anyone in the Confederacy because they were seeking to keep my people enslaved, and there is no avoiding that reality. We can couch it in questions of heritage and honor, but ultimately these were domestic terrorists whose statuary was actually put up not in the wake of Reconstruction, but in the wake of the 1920s and 30s, when more and more communities of color, particularly Black communities, started to gain some degree of access. And so I do not support them. But what I told her was that she thought that was going to be the first thing I did should I become governor. It would not be, but it would have been a conversation on the list, because we have to reckon with our past. And we have to reckon with the fact that if we speak aloud a belief that systemic racism should not exist, we cannot then glorify those who were the architects of that very racism. And that's not to say they were the only ones, but they were the ones who declared war on our nation to make it so. And that means that they should not be given glory and honor, particularly in public spaces.
We're right up to the end here, and I think it's always fun to end on a somewhat less weighty note.
Okay.
And this one actually does have a bit of a political implication to it. You've become part, as you're looking at a national Democratic campaign possibly, you've become part of one very high-profile Republican race in that all-comers contest for one of Georgia's U.S. Senate seats. Both incumbent Kelly Loeffler and Congressman Doug Collins have gone after each other for appearing in photos with you. First of all, I assume you don't mind because public images are public images, but do you still have good professional relationships with Doug Collins and Kelly Loeffler?
Doug and I were most recently engaged in a bit of a sparring match at a congressional hearing. So anyone who thinks that we agree about anything other than the fact that we served together and had moments of common cause, but you will often notice that there were other Republicans and other Democrats right there with us. I was the lawyer for Kelly Loeffler when she was one of the part owners of the Dream. And we have not spoken since 2018, but I will say this: if they both want to wield my photo to crush each other, leaving room for Raphael Warnock to become the next U.S. Senator from the great state of Georgia, I say congratulations.
But you have at least cordial, I don't know whether you'd call it personal or professional, just exchanges with both of them?
I'm cordial with everyone, Dennis.
By the way, using your pen name for your other literary life, Selena Montgomery, you once named a character Doug Collins. Any plans for a Kelly Loeffler character just to keep it even?
I'm currently writing much more nonfiction, and I'd be happy to write the biography of Raphael Warnock when he becomes the senator who replaces Kelly Loeffler.
By the way, as Selena Montgomery, you are 2/3 of the way through a trilogy. You have 2 books published.
Yes.
And back in February of last year, I asked you how that 3rd book was coming. Any updates from Selena Montgomery?
I got a bit distracted. Selena remained on hiatus. I had to create Fair Fight, Fair Count, SEEP. There have been elections. There's been a lot of stuff happening. There was a pandemic. I would say that there continued delays, but they're going back to the very first question. I have a very good intent.
Stacey Abrams, it has been a pleasure, and I want to thank everybody watching. You can provide your own thunderous applause. Maybe the History Center can, in the future, just put in a recording of like an Atlanta United home game.
It might blow out our speakers on our laptop, though.
That's a great crowd. The book is Our Time Is Now. Stacey Abrams, it has been, there it is. Mine's kind of out of reach.
It's okay.
Thank you so much. It has been a pleasure to talk to you. Thanks for making this time, and we will look forward to talking to you in the future.
Thank you so much.
Thanks to the Atlanta History Center and everybody who submitted questions. Apologies to those we didn't get to. Please come back for more in the Author Talk series at the Atlanta History Center. I'm Dennis O'Hare for Stacey Abrams. Thanks a lot and good night.